What is the perfect rep range to build muscle? If you spend any time in the gym, you've probably heard the same advice repeated over and over again. Low reps build strength, 8 to 12 reps build muscle, high reps are for toning. This idea has been passed down in gyms for decades. It's repeated in magazines, workout programs, and across social media. The problem is that it isn't entirely true. The human body doesn't simply work that way. In reality, you can build muscle using rep ranges as low as 5 reps, and in some cases even fewer, and you can also build muscle using rep ranges as high as 20 or even 30 repetitions. So if that's the case, why do some rep ranges feel better than others? Why do certain ranges seem to produce better results? And why do some people thrive on heavier weights while others appear to grow well using higher repetitions? The truth is that there isn't a single perfect rep range that works for everyone. Instead, there are several factors that determine what rep range will work best for you. Your goals, your recovery ability, your experience level, the equipment you have access to, and even the sport you participate in all influence what rep range makes the most sense. And once you understand these factors, you'll stop changing the mythical hypertrophy zone and start training in a way that is actually far more productive. One of the biggest misconceptions in the fitness industry is the idea that certain rep ranges produces completely different physical adaptations. You've probably heard something like this before. You train with very low reps, you'll build strength. If you train with 8 to 12 reps, you'll build muscle. And if you train with higher reps, you tone the muscle or develop muscular endurance. But the human body doesn't categorize training in such a rigid way. Muscle growth isn't determined by a magical number of repetitions. Instead, muscle growth occurs when muscle fibers are sufficiently stimulated and challenged. When the muscle is pushed close to its limits, the body adapts by repairing and strengthening those fibers, which results in hypertrophy. In other words, the key driver of muscle growth is not the rep range itself. It is the recruitment of muscle fibers and the level of effort applied during the set. This is why research has consistently shown that muscle growth can occur across a wide range of repetitions, provided the sets are performed with enough intensity. You can build muscle doing 5 reps, you can build muscle doing 10 reps, you can even build muscle doing 20 or 30 reps. The muscle doesn't know how many repetitions you are performing. What it responds to is tension, fatigue, and fiber recruitment. To understand why multiple rep ranges can build muscle, you need to understand how the body recruits muscle fibers during a set. When you begin lifting a weight, your body initially recruits the muscle fibers that are necessary to move that load. If the weight is relatively light, the body starts by recruiting smaller, lower threshold motor units. But as the set continues and fatigue builds, the body gradually recruits larger and more powerful motor units to maintain force production. This process continues until eventually the entire muscle is working at near capacity. This is why pushing a set close to muscular failure is so effective for hypertrophy. As the set becomes harder, more and more fibers are forced to participate. Whether that happens in 5 reps or 20 reps is less important than the fact that it happens at all. The muscle simply responds to the demand placed upon it. Now, let's talk about the lower end of the spectrum. Rep ranges between roughly 5 and 8 repetitions are often associated with strength training, but they can also be extremely effective for building muscle. One of the biggest advantages of lower rep ranges is the use of heavier weights. Heavier loads create high levels of mechanical tension within the muscle, which is one of the primary drivers of hypertrophy. Another advantage is efficiency. When you train in lower rep ranges, you can reach a very challenging level of effort in a relatively short period of time. A set of 6 heavy repetitions can push a muscle very close to failure without requiring prolonged effort. This means you can stimulate the muscle effectively without accumulating excessive metabolic fatigue. However, there are some drawbacks. Lifting heavier weights requires good technique and control. If someone lacks proper form or experience, heavy lifting can increase the risk of injury. For beginners especially, jumping straight into very low rep ranges may not be ideal. There is also more joint stress involved when lifting very heavy loads, which means careful programming and recovery become important. So while lower rep ranges are highly effective, they require a certain level of skill and responsibility within the gym. Now let's talk about the range that most people associate with hypertrophy training, roughly the 8 to 12 repetitions. This rep range became popular largely through bodybuilding culture and for good reason. It provides a balance between load and fatigue. The weight is heavy enough to create meaningful tension in the muscle, but not so heavy that technique becomes difficult to maintain. At the same time, the number of repetitions is high enough to generate metabolic stress and a strong muscular contraction. For many lifters, this range simply feels productive. It allows them to push sets close to failure without the intimidating loads associated with very heavy training. But the key thing to understand is that this range is not magical, it is simply practical. It sits comfortably in the middle of the spectrum where both tension and fatigue are present without either becoming extreme. At the other end of the spectrum, we have higher repetition training. This might involve sets of 12, 15, 20, or even 30 repetitions. Contrary to popular belief, these higher rep ranges can absolutely stimulate muscle growth, but they come with a unique challenge. When performing very high repetitions, the limiting factor often becomes something other than the muscle itself. You might experience a burning sensation, cardiovascular fatigue, or simply general exhaustion before the muscle actually reaches true failure. In other words, the set might end because of discomfort rather than because the muscle is completely fatigued. This is why higher rep training can sometimes be less efficient for hypertrophy. It takes longer to reach the level of fatigue required to fully recruit muscle fibers. However, it does not mean higher rep training is useless. In fact, in certain situations, it becomes necessary. One of the most overlooked factors in rep range selection is equipment. If you have access to a fully equipped gym with barbells, dumbbells, machines, and adjustable resistance, you can easily manipulate load. You can simply increase the weight and stay within moderate rep ranges. But what if you don't have access to heavy equipment? What if you're training at home using only bodyweight movements? In that situation, higher rep ranges often become unavoidable. For example, if someone can perform 20 push-ups comfortably, the only way to make the exercise challenging is to perform more repetitions, slow the tempo, or increase time under tension. Without the ability to add load, the body must be challenged through volume. This is why many calisthenics athletes develop impressive physiques despite using primarily higher rep ranges. They simply push their muscles to the point where those fibers must adapt. Another factor that many people overlook is recovery. Higher repetition training tends to produce significant metabolic fatigue. The muscles burn, breathing increases, and the body accumulates a large amount of stress during the workout. For some individuals, this type of training is manageable, but for others, particularly natural lifters with busy schedules, excess fatigue can interfere with recovery. This becomes even more relevant when you consider that most people do not train full time. They have jobs, responsibilities, and limited time to rest and recover. In those situations, extremely high rep training performed frequently can become difficult to sustain. This is the reason why many experienced lifters eventually gravitate towards slightly lower rep ranges. They allow the muscle to be stimulated effectively without creating unnecessary exhaustion. Another important factor is the goal of the training itself. If the primary goal is hypertrophy, simply building as much muscle as possible, then moderate rep ranges often provide the best balance between tension and fatigue. But if the goal is performance within a sport, the equation changes. Many sports require the muscles to produce force repeatedly over extended periods of time. Combat sports, rowing, cycling, and other endurance-based activities require muscular endurance. In these cases, high repetition training becomes extremely valuable. The muscles learn to sustain effort over longer durations, so the ideal rep range is not always determined by aesthetics alone. It is often dictated by the demands of the activity you are training for. So after considering all these factors, the answer becomes surprisingly simple. There is no single perfect rep range for building muscle. Muscle growth can occur across a broad spectrum of repetitions. What matters most is that the muscle is challenged, that sufficient fibers are recruited, and that the training can be repeated consistently over time. However, if the goal is efficient hypertrophy for the average lifter, many people will find that staying somewhere between 5 and 10 repetitions works extremely well. This range allows you to lift challenging weights, reach muscular fatigue relatively quickly, and manage recovery effectively. But within that range, variation can be beneficial. Different exercises, different phases of training, and different personal preferences all play a role. So instead of searching for the perfect rep range, it might be better to focus on better questions. Are you training with enough intensity? Are your sets challenging? Are you pushing your muscles close to their limits? And perhaps most importantly, can you recover from the training you're doing so that you can come back and repeat that effort again and again? Because in the long run, consistency and progressive overload will always matter more than the exact number of repetitions you perform. The muscle doesn't care whether you did 6 reps or 16. It only cares that you challenged it enough to force it to adapt. So before this video comes to an end, I'd be curious to know your experience. What rep range do you feel works best for you? Do you prefer heavier weights and lower reps, or do you enjoy the burn that comes with high repetition training? Let me know in the comments below.